11:03 is the time. Very good evening if you're just joining me here on LBC. Ben Kentish here with you for another couple of hours. I want to have a conversation with you between now and 12 o'clock or so about long COVID, which we hear today is being totally ignored and neglected. Warnings from experts in papers today that it risks going the same way as ME by basically not being taken as seriously as it should have been. Campaigners warning that the 2 million people in this country that are suffering with it are being badly neglected because of a lack of focus politically, a lack of prioritisation from health service, and of course, as ever, a lack of funding. 2 million people. It's almost 1 in 30 of us right now suffering from this illness. If that's you or your loved ones, would love to hear from you this hour about the impact it's had on your life. I think it's actually pretty appalling, the way that the media, the government officials have basically turned their backs on people who have got long COVID and aren't putting the resources in to dealing with it that are necessary. I know actually a couple in their early 30s who got COVID right at the very start of the pandemic. And I'm honestly, I assure you, I'm not exaggerating to say it's absolutely ruined their lives. They can't do anything. They can't go out. They can't work. They've lost their income. They basically, and of course, the mental health problems that come with that are enormous. It has completely destroyed, hopefully temporarily, their lives. And this has gone on for 4 years. And I know there are many, many other people in a similar situation, some in an even worse situation. And for some, thankfully, it's a bit more mild, but still very debilitating. And yet, how often is it talked about? How often do people in that situation actually get a voice? It must feel like you are just shouting into the wind. Well, for this hour, I hope it won't. Because if you are someone that's battling long COVID or someone in your family or your life is, pick up the phone and give me a ring. 0345 6060 973. It's incredibly common. It's incredibly debilitating. I'm really interested in hearing your experiences and your stories of it. 0345 6060 973, that number once again. Come to your calls on that in a few minutes. Delighted to be joined first to kick off our conversation tonight by Dr. David Strain, Professor of Cardiometabolic Health at the University of Exeter Medical School and a former member of the government's Long COVID Task Force, which no longer exists. David, a very good evening to you. Let's start, shall we, with what we know about long COVID and what we don't. There's still a lot of uncertainty, isn't there, about exactly what this illness is and about how it affects people.
Long COVID itself as a disease is still broadly classified into people who got complications of their acute COVID infections, which are the things that we do understand. These are people who got strokes or blood clots in the lungs or other problems that are actually exactly the same as if they'd got those strokes for other reasons. But then there's a wider group of people that actually, numerically, it's a lot more that have this fatiguing illness, that they get the post-exertional malaise, they have brain fog, they've got an unexplained cough, which is massively disproportionate to the initial infection that they had. And that's the group of people that we really don't understand what the underlying cause is. We're getting a lot closer. There's a growing evidence base that at least some of them have persistent virus. That means basically the virus infected them when they had the initial disease and then found somewhere to hide in the body, whether it be the brain or the gut. And when they do anything, it sneaks out again and causes them to have this flu-like illness. There's other people whose immune system hasn't responded quite as it should, and therefore they weren't able to clear it properly. And these are the two hypotheses that we are mostly working on at the moment, but not everybody with the disease is the same, and therefore it's entirely possible that the underlying cause is slightly different in these different groups as well.
We'll come on to talk about some of those people and how they've been affected in a moment, David. But I wanted to ask you, how much focus is this getting from scientists and the government? And is it enough in your view?
So there's two different elements here. The first is the research into it. And unfortunately, we're now in a position where research into long COVID is competing with research into every other long-term disease that doesn't have quite the budget in order to tackle what we need to do. And unfortunately, as a whole, there just isn't enough research money. In fact, for that matter, there's not enough academic clinicians who are out there doing the research into all of these disease areas. And briefly, because it was a very targeted focus on long COVID, everybody, whether they had an interest in the heart or the brain or the lungs, realized that long COVID had something in it for them and worked together as big collaborations. Now these clinical academics are moving back to the natural disease areas. They're moving back to lung disease or heart disease or their diabetes or whichever was the interest for them. And therefore, it's about keeping the clinical academics, those brains behind it, and then the money in order to support the research going forward. And unfortunately, research is just incredibly expensive these days.
And but doesn't that come back to political will? I mean, is it fair to say the government has not shown a great deal of interest in long COVID, the consequences of it? You were a member of Task Force, David, I believe, that, well, you tell me, but no longer exists.
Absolutely. I mean, the NHS task force in long COVID was put together in order to tackle an emerging crisis. 2 million people in the UK with a disease that hadn't been explained. And that was put together very quickly. It established services. It established a desire to do the research. The problem is that as we move back to business as usual, the long COVID task force was disbanded because people suddenly became more interested in addressing the long-term diseases that were already in existence. They became keen to try and address the unprecedented waiting lists. And unfortunately, long COVID just slipped off the agenda at that time. And remember, this is at a time that the politicians were very keen to sweep COVID under the carpet to pretend that it never actually happened. And therefore, the long COVID research arm just fell by the wayside.
That's pretty scandalous, if you ask me, to be honest. And as you say, Dave, this is not some sort of fringe, tiny, minor condition that affects a handful of people. 2 million people, according to the figures. A fifth of them say that the long COVID has limited their ability to undertake daily activities a lot. And I was quite struck by the finding that 70% say that their symptoms started at least a year before. So it's not just impacting people in a serious way, it's also impacted them for a very long time.
Absolutely. I mean, we've still got people in our long COVID clinic that have been suffering with this disease since that initial wave back in 2020. They've had the disease now for 3.5, getting on for 4 years. And it's very clear that they are not getting better on their own. And it's really important to say that these are the young, the fit, the people who should be the cornerstones of getting the economy back on its feet, getting the workforce back out there. These are the people that should be building the society of the future, when instead, actually, they are still suffering the consequences of long COVID 3 or 4 years later. But what does stagger me is that in my clinic, we are seeing a tremendous number of people are getting better. It's about 20% of people start to show recovery, but that 2 million number isn't going down, which suggests that even today, people catching the very mild forms of COVID are still being left with long COVID that's debilitating.
So even with vaccinations, even many people have had 3, 4, 5 vaccines, long COVID isn't something that just affects the unvaccinated. People who have had all those jabs are still getting it right now.
Absolutely. I mean, we saw that vaccination reduced the risk of getting long COVID by somewhere between 50 and 80%, depending on which studies you looked at. And I think a big confounder there was they were looking at different variants. We moved from Delta to Omicron and so on. But although it's reduced the risk of catching it, it hasn't taken it away completely. And people who got COVID in that last wave that we got just after Christmas are now coming to us in the long COVID service, or many of them are coming through the ME service today, saying that they are still suffering with those symptoms that is just long COVID by a different variant.
And these are people who, David, as you say, in many cases won't be able to work, or won't be able to work to the extent that they were before. How do you square what seems to me a total lack of focus and attention on long COVID on the one hand, with the government's drive, desperation almost, to get people back to work and off benefits on the other? It seems to me those two things are very closely linked, or at least should be.
It is, and that's a very pertinent question at the moment. I mean, we heard Rishi Sunak just the other week talking about how he wants to reform pensions, and he wants to reform sick benefits and the sick notes and this whole sick note culture. And the reality is, these are the young fit people who caught COVID and have ended up with longer term consequences. And of course, not all of them have this diagnosis of long COVID, but when you get 20, 25-year-olds with neurological diseases or with mental health problems, and we know that the COVID virus infected the brain and caused significant slowing of mental health, it's very difficult not to put two and two together and say that what we are seeing at the moment is an increase in overall sickness that is in some way driven either directly by long COVID or indirectly by the consequences of lack of investment in the overall public health infrastructure that put us in the position that we are.
It's incredible. It's incredible that politicians haven't put those two things together. David, I wanted to ask you about a little bit of a report that came out in Australia. I'm sure you've seen it a few weeks ago. A lot of media coverage, and it was basically clinicians, medics there saying long COVID isn't real. Actually, the impact, the long-term impacts of COVID are no different to those of other viruses, and we should stop pretending that long COVID is some sort of distinct illness. What do you say? What do you make of that, and what would you say to them?
So it's very difficult. For the last 7 or 8 years or so, I've been involved in treatment of people with myalgic encephalomyelitis, or ME, chronic fatigue syndrome. And they too have got a post-viral illness. Now, for them, the majority of patients are affected by a virus such as Epstein-Barr virus, which causes glandular fever, or some of the other viruses that belong to the herpes family that get into the body. They're very, very common in all of us, and then they leave a small group of people with long-standing symptoms. So if you say, is long COVID as a post-viral illness something new? The answer to that is very clearly no. ME, CFS, that's been around since the 80s. And actually, if you track back the 1918 flu pandemic that occurred back then, that left a significant proportion of people with something called lethargic or encephalitis, which looked just like Parkinson's. And actually, if you want to read about that or hear about that, the film The Awakenings with Robin Williams and Robert De Niro was a fabulous track down how this post-viral illness led to the discovery of dopamine. So post-viral illnesses is well established. However, the thing that really disturbed me about that report was that it seemed to suggest that these people who are living with severe fatigue, with palpitations, with inability to think straight, that they are in some way it's just in the minds that they're making this up. Now, I'm looking after these patients on a regular basis, and the majority of them want nothing more than to be doing everything that they were pre-COVID. They want to be looking after their families. They want to be going out of the work. For many of us, our jobs actually define who we are. And, to call the 120,000 or so healthcare workers who are still not able to work because they contracted COVID during the first wave of the pandemic, saying that it's all in the mind, I think actually is just insulting to those people who did everything that they could and have been left with this debilitating illness now. But the stigma associated with this is something that we're going to have to tackle to make sure we don't make the same mistakes that happened in the 80s and 90s when ME was called yuppie flu and other such
and there has been some of that already. I've seen some newspaper headlines almost mocking it as a sort of a fake illness, and as you say, very important to counter that and combat that. David, let's finish, if we get on a slightly more upbeat note. I wanted to ask you about treatments. You said 20% of people in your clinic have shown some sort of signs of improvement. I guess that means 80% haven't, which is slightly worrying. But what sort of treatment is there for people with long COVID, and is it the case that those treatments are getting more effective the more we learn about it?
So the first thing to say is that at the moment, most of the treatments are symptomatic. When it comes to treating long COVID, we have those symptoms that make people feel better, but not addressing the underlying cause. And then we are starting to look at treatments that actually address the underlying cause. And I mean, here at the University of Exeter, we are doing a lot of the basic research into underlying triggers and how we might address that. When it comes to things that make people feel better, actually the first data, and still probably the best, is this evidence about singing lessons. And that's now been backed up with classes on yoga. And we know that both of those are really strong vagal nerve stimulators.
Cooking.
So we know that these things are really good at keeping the body cool, about keeping things very healthy. The thing that we're now looking at is we've been working with a group, Atomarker, who've now got a test that can identify people who have a deficiency in their immune system that still suggests that they've got a virus on board. And in the very near future, we're launching a study that's going to be looking at antivirals that specifically enter the brain, that specifically get to where we think the virus is hiding, and start looking at, can we tackle this with an antiviral treatment? Now, I have to say, we're just in the very early phases of that, so please don't call me up yet for it, but we are very likely to be rolling this out over the next 4 or 5 weeks, that we start the early phase treatments before moving this forward. There are other treatments that are being tried, and the important thing here is that most of these treatments are looking at addressing underlying causes as well as symptoms. And I do think the next 3 or 4 years we will start to see treatments that make people's lives much better, but also address the underlying cause for both long COVID, and hopefully the knock-on effect will also be able to treat people living with ME and chronic fatigue syndrome as we discover more about this disease.
Fascinating stuff, David. Thank you so much for coming on tonight. Dr. David Strain is a professor of cardiometabolic health at the University of Exeter Medical School, former member of the now defunct, says it all, doesn't it, Government Long COVID Task Force. Really, really want to hear from you. If you are someone who has been diagnosed with long COVID, or someone who thinks you are suffering the consequences of it. 2 million people in this country thought to have long COVID. If you're one of them, if someone in your family is, if you have friends that you, or people in your life that you know that are struggling with this, pick up the phone. Call me, 0345 6060 973. Or if you are a medical professional, you work in the NHS, that you are seeing the consequences and the reality of this, not necessarily in your personal life, but in your professional one, would love to hear from you this hour too. Come to your calls about all things long COVID after this. Ben Kentish on LBC. It's 11:20.
Weekdays from 7am. 973.
11:23 the time. If you are someone struggling or suffering with long COVID, this is your chance to share your story and maybe put a little bit of pressure, necessary pressure if you ask me, on the politicians and yes, the NHS leaders to take this seriously, because it seems it's not being taken seriously right now. Let's talk to Penny in Pimlico about all this. Hi, Penny.
Hi, Ben. Thanks for taking my call.
You're so welcome.
Well, I have been quite unwell recently. I've had pneumonia, sepsis, collapsed lung, pleurisy, and fluid on my heart.
Penny, I'm so sorry.
Well, I'm going to make a recovery. I'm
Good.
on the right way. But my point is, and I listened to your professor from Exeter, is really that we need to be taken seriously as patients, that we're not just diagnosed as having a chest x-ray or blood test, but we're people dealing with actually a very complex condition. Mm-hmm. I did have COVID 18 months ago, and I did have a couple of COVID vaccines, but I think this is really complex. And your professor thought about, viruses as opposed to bacterial infections. And I think people that have been hit by COVID, and myself by pneumonia and sepsis, we actually, our bodies are absolutely hammered. And I think there is something about the long-term management of patients who've been really ill. I have had very little follow-up from my GP since I've been seriously ill. But I have needed to go back to A&E a few times for chest x-rays and blood tests because I haven't been getting better. And I think, the whole point about, I understand ME and the fact that people were not recognised as having a condition and it was all psychosomatic.
Yep.
Well, I think people with COVID, long-term COVID, have the same problem in attitude towards their condition.
Being told that it's basically all in their head, it's not a proper disease, and they just need to sort of get a grip and go back to work.
Absolutely, and yet I know it's really damaging. I mean, I have been ill for 3 months. I know it's going to take another couple of months at least. It's difficult from a psychological point of view, from a work point of view, from a family point of view. It's very, very limiting. I mean, I can probably go out for an hour and do... I'm a very fit person, I was. But, I am very debilitated by this. So I really feel that the whole COVID, long COVID, should be taken extremely seriously by the providers of healthcare.
Penny, sorry, just to be clear, how long after you had COVID did you suffer the pneumonia and the rest of the things you described?
About a year.
About a year. So it's quite a long time. Is the suggestion, or is your belief, that was directly linked to having COVID?
I'm not sure,
right.
But I have had respiratory problems in the past. But I had 2 vaccines in between that time, and I am not sure. I don't like taking vaccines, and I did it because it was the important thing to do. But I am still concerned that we don't know exactly the impact of the vaccines we had at very speed, a lot of speed, but also the impact of COVID on myself, which I was proved to be negative when I got seriously ill 3 months ago. So, but we have COVID is just, COVID-19 is one of 19 types of COVID. So I think we have a lot of problems. Yes.
So 19 was the year that it originated, wasn't it?
I think it was COVID-19 as in the number of COVID infections we've had. I may be wrong.
I might be wrong too. I thought it was the year that it originated. I might well be wrong.
I think we've had COVID, SARS, and other epidemics of COVID.
There's definitely other coronaviruses. I thought the name was to do with the year, but let's not get them down in scientific categorisation.
The way is that we've been dealing with a bacterial infection for many, many years, and possibly back to the Spanish problems in.
But it was interesting, wasn't it? It was interesting to hear David talk about the sort of the issues that arose after some of the previous flu pandemics and previous viral pandemics, with people actually suffering sort of similar symptoms and similar signs of some sort of long-term illness that followed that. Penny, lovely to talk to you. Wish you well. Wish you all the best. Thank you. Angela on Twitter, long COVID does not exist, vaccine injuries do. Well, yes, of course some people have negative impacts, negative response to the vaccine, Angela. Long COVID does not exist. You tell that to the people I know whose lives have been absolutely ruined by it long before they ever had a vaccine. It's utter nonsense. It's offensive, I'm afraid, to tell people who haven't been able to work, or in some cases leave the house almost for the last 4 years, that they're suffering a fictional illness. Come on, talk to them. They'll tell you that it's very, very real. Chris is calling from Twickenham on this. Chris.
Hi, Ben. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, I'm all right, thank you. All right-ish, as it can get.
All right-ish.
I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry or just get very angry with the ridiculous response of it doesn't exist.
Do you know what? There's a few texts coming in saying it's not real, Chris.
Boy, send them around to me.
It's real for you.
It's very real for me. I was... I got ill in March 2020, and for 5 days I was ringing 111 and trying to get some help, and they were saying they wouldn't send an ambulance out. There's no availability at all. And then I sort of screamed at 999, and eventually they sent somebody out and said they'd take me in, and I was put into A&E for half an hour, and then straight up to ICU, ITU, and then I was intubated and put into a coma. It was an induced coma, and taken out of it because obviously I couldn't breathe at all, and was on the intubation for, I'm not quite sure, a week or so, maybe more. Don't really have any memory of that. But it was a 50-50 chance of survival, and anyway, I survived, so that's great. And the next 2 years, I felt very much like I was going to die because I was getting zero help. Nobody knew what to do.
Sorry, Chris, for 2 years?
At least 2 years, yeah.
2 years you felt like you were going to die because no one was helping you?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
What did you need help with? Having come through the induced coma, coming out of I mean, God, I can hear you still struggling with it. What's the lasting? What's the lasting damage?
My lungs were damaged. I had pneumonia on each lung, and when it's called from coughing, get you can bruise the lungs around the ribs, right. And it feels like you're having a heart attack. So right. I genuinely thought I was having a heart attack for a long time since then, and then was referred to the lung consultant at the hospital, and nothing. They said, well, it's not the lungs are clear, and I'm going, well, I'm really surprised by that. But then they referred me to the heart department, and it turns out I have, and I don't know if it's as a result of that, but the hospital are pretty sure it isn't. I now have a mitral valve leakage, and so the mitral valve has to be replaced in the next 3 or 4 weeks. So I don't know if that's linked, but it certainly felt like it is because it's just been constant, ongoing. And I can hear you. Your lungs are not what they should be. Yeah, it's hell. My memory is rubbish, and I gave up work immediately.
And how? If I said to you, what have the last 4 years been like, Chris? I mean, you've sort of answered it, but it sounds like hell.
Yeah, absolute hell, and incredibly depressing, and I don't really see what's going to happen that's going to improve it. I've been trying to desperately get onto trials, and I quite wanted to even go down to Exeter for things. Just listening to David just then, and I've been to a GP a number of times. I've been swapped GPs just because I moved, and they've been great, very sympathetic, fantastically sympathetic. But everybody has agreed, including all the people in the hospital as well. We can't do anything because we don't know what it is. We don't know anything.
Well, there's no support out there, or there's no help out there for people in your situation.
And they don't know what help to do.
Well, the government had a long COVID task force. We're just hearing, weren't we, Chris? The government had the NHS had a long COVID task force, and it inexplicably abolished it. I mean, what message does that send? And then you have people texting in saying it's not a real illness. I mean,
not real,
you must just despair.
I lost a very good friend because she's convinced that actually it's all just rubbish and all the ridiculous.
And there you are needing surgery and coughing your guts out. Chris, I'm so sorry. Yeah. What message would you like people to take away when it comes to the lasting damage of COVID, if they are sceptical?
Depends who I was speaking to. If I was speaking to somebody like Rishi Sunak, I'd say just get a grip and do something for all the people. And I'm one of the lucky ones because I survived. Just go and have a look at all the hearts of the people who've died, and
It's funny, isn't it? Because there's the COVID inquiry that's rightly focusing on the mistakes that were made and how things were handled, as if it's all in the past. And then you've got people like you that are trying to screaming from the rooftops, we're still here, we're still suffering because of this, and the government's just not listening. No one's listening, it sounds like.
Yeah. I joined eventually in a sort of desperate attempt, I joined a group on Facebook, which has been fantastic, I must admit, and it's people just all over the world. There's an awful lot in this country and all over the world.
2 million of you here in the UK alone.
Incredible, yeah. And just with very similar problems, but also some who are completely different.
What's it called, Chris, the group?
I think it's just a long COVID support group.
I'm sure there might be a lot of people that will, want to check out online resources because it seems there's very little else that's out there in terms of support. Chris, I really wish you all the best. I really wish you well. I mean, I can hear the impact it's had, not just on your physical health, but it would have an impact on your well-being, on your mental health too, especially when you're not getting heard and you're not getting the support. I really, really genuinely hope that changes. Chris, all the best to you. Keep us posted, won't you? That was Chris in Twickenham. Ray says, best wishes, Chris, for a better recovery. Well said, Ray in Grimsby. Talk more about long COVID in a couple of moments.
To LBC.
It is 11:51. Ben Kentish here with you on LBC. Lots of texts coming in about long COVID. This from George in Cyprus. George says, COVID-19 attacks the lungs and causes damage that will never fully recover. If you've had COVID badly without being vaccinated, your lungs may never recover, so you'll have long COVID for the rest of your life. It happened to me, George says. I'm on an oxygen machine at least 10 hours a day. This comes in from Toyosi. Long COVID. What about the side effects of the people who got vaccinated? Shortly after I received my first vaccine in June 2021, I've been experiencing chest pain, numbness around my left arm, constant tiredness, breathing problems and other things. You say people who are suffering from long COVID are not taken seriously, but as far as I can see, the concerns of people like me and many other people who have been adversely affected by the vaccine are not taken into consideration. It's a fair point, Toyosi, but both are true, aren't they? You can absolutely think that people like you need to be listened to and heard and treated fairly and treated seriously, and also think that people with long COVID should. And I'm sorry to hear that happened to you. You know, people who had bad effects, bad reactions to the vaccine. It's a tiny minority of people that take the vaccine, but of course you and those other people need to be looked after if you've been unlucky enough to be affected in that way. And again, I'm sorry that you were. Heather in Bromley texts, Ben, I caught COVID at the very start of the pandemic in March 2020 and was hospitalised twice. I've been mainly housebound and bedbound with long COVID ever since. I get 1 or 2 hours out of bed each day if I am lucky. I've had severe cardiac, neurological, pulmonary and energy issues non-stop ever since and rushed to A&E on several occasions. I'm in utter despair 4 years later, with no recovery in sight. Heather, I'm so sorry. Again, I mean, there's just very little support, very little help out there. And of course that leaves people feeling complete despair at what their future might look like. Now, as we were hearing earlier, David was saying the treatments are getting better. They are getting more understanding of what long COVID is. Hopefully there's light at the end of the tunnel, but my goodness, it's a very long and a very dark tunnel for poor Heather and many, many others. 2 million people in this country suffering from long COVID. Tens of thousands of NHS workers have had to give up their jobs because they are suffering from a disease that many of them contracted while caring for the rest of us. What do the politicians have to say about it? What do the NHS leaders have to say about it? As far as I can see, almost nothing. Gareth's new caller in Gwent calling to talk more about this. Hi, Gareth. Welcome.
Hi, Ben.
Thank you for calling in. What made you pick up the phone tonight, Gareth?
Long COVID is of a great interest to me personally. I speak as one of the millions around the world as someone living with long COVID. So I got COVID back in April 2020 during the first wave of the pandemic. At that time, the general consensus was that it was just going to be a 2-week flu and you recover. And it was only those who were elderly or had underlying conditions had to worry. So at that point, I was 42. I was healthy, no underlying conditions. I had a good career. I was actually in training for a triathlon at the time when I fell ill with COVID. And quite frankly, I hadn't recovered 100% since then. So in the initial stages, I was pretty much bedbound. I had any number of symptoms. Initially, it was fever, fatigue, which then developed into other, pretty scary symptoms.
Like what, Gary?
I had a condition called POTS, which meant that I couldn't stand up for very long. I had to learn how to walk again. I had hair loss. I lost a lot of weight. I lost my speech at one point. I had chronic insomnia, so I couldn't sleep. And it was
pretty bad. Very bad.
Yeah, definitely.
And that, you're training for triathlons. You're clearly a fit man. Have you been able to work since, or how has that been impacted?
So during that time when I was especially ill, I had to give up work. I couldn't exercise. I was at the time I was living by myself in a flat in Cardiff, and I was forced to move back in with my parents so they could look after me.
Because you just weren't well enough to live alone.
Yeah, I couldn't look after myself. Yeah.
Wow.
No. And it's I think, looking back, my main concern was about my parents because they're both elderly. My father's clinically vulnerable. Never did I think that they would be looking after me.
How old are you, Gareth, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm now 46.
So you're a young, fit man, and this has floored you.
Yeah, it's turned my life upside down, absolutely.
And I think you said things are slightly better now, or not?
It's been a slow process. I feel lucky in that I've been able to recover somewhat. I'm able to function. I'm back working again, but I do still have some lingering symptoms, which I'm doing my best to manage.
And this is over 4 years now.
Over 4 years now, yeah.
Wow. And Gareth, what kind of help have you been able? Or what is there any help that you've been given, or is it just a case of just waiting and gradual improvement?
Yeah, so going back to the early stages of the pandemic, there was very little in the way of help. This was at a point where long COVID didn't have a name even. I would argue it still doesn't have a name because long COVID is a name ascribed to it by patients themselves. I think, the medical community are sort of slowly catching up. But in terms of, we still don't have a diagnostic test. So if you catch long COVID and you go to your doctor, there's no test that can give you to say that you have long COVID. And in addition to that, in terms of treatments, there's no sort of agreed consensus at the moment about what treatments are available, especially given that long COVID presents itself differently amongst various patients. So, I appreciate it's a complex situation, but
do you feel like you're taken seriously when you talk to doctors and medics about it, or do they take you seriously and just not know enough about it? Or is there, just get this sense, maybe not from doctors, there's a lot of people out there, including the media, that just are determined, seemingly, to conclude that long COVID isn't real, or it's just sort of, it's in people's heads, or it's not really that bad, or it's, all the things that that David was describing. Do you think you were taken seriously, Gareth?
Not at all, initially. I heard stories in the media about certain people not recovering from COVID, and I would show them these headlines and these reports, and they just dismissed them out of hand. So I wasn't initially hospitalised, but when I did go in for tests, and this is common amongst a lot of long COVID patients, is that all my tests came back normal, and on that basis, they judged me to be depressed or anxious.
Depressed?
Yeah. And, which,
depression doesn't cover all the symptoms that you've just told me about.
Well, exactly, yeah.
Oh, what nonsense. Oh, Gareth, I'm glad things are going in the right direction. You're back at work. You still living with your parents, or are you able to move out again? I moved out, yeah. I just want to, on the back of what Chris was talking about earlier, the Long COVID Support Charity, I've since joined up with them, and they're all doing a fantastic job. I'm glad you mentioned them, Gareth, because I was just about to do it as well. Long COVID Support are there, they say, to help you, to hear from you. If you are someone who suffers from long COVID, you can find them online. longcovid.org is their website if you're someone like Gareth or Chris as well, looking for support. Gareth, I wish you well. I'm glad it's going in the right direction, and I hope that continues. Thank you very much for calling in. Coming up after the news, we're going to talk about road rage. Up 40% in the